Hello, everybody. How are you? I'm Jessica Strand, the Director of Public Programs here at the Library Foundation. It's nice to see you all here. And before we begin the program this evening, in the spirit of reconciliation, the Los Angeles Public Library recognizes and acknowledges the first people of this land. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all indigenous peoples today. Sorry about that. For all those not familiar with the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, we are a private, nonprofit organization devoted to fundraising, advocacy, and innovative programming in the support of the Los Angeles Public Library. Thank you for any members in the audience and for being here with us this evening. And if you are not yet a member, I hope that you will consider joining to support critical library services and to support programs like this one. Our initiatives are for children, teens, and adults all over Los Angeles. We help to support services like adult literacy, Read Baby Read, the list goes on. Anyway, you're helping to improve the lives of many Angelinos by joining. This is our last program in the taper until September. We will be hitting the road only for a couple of programs. On July 15th, we'll be at Pacific Palisades branch hosting a kind of summer festival with 2 great book talks and improv performance, activities, food trucks, the list goes on. And on August 17th, we'll be at the Griffith Observatory, and I'm gonna hold off on the details of that, but I can promise you it will be really fantastic. So, for more information about our programs, go to Allowed at lfla.org/allowed, and you'll have more information about everything. Now, for this evening's program, I'm excited to have these 2 wonderful novelists, Tess Gunty and Claire Vaye Watkins, with us this evening. Tess Gunty's extraordinary debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, takes us into an affordable housing complex in a post-industrial Indiana town. Gunty moves in and out of apartments, giving us a deep sense of all the characters living in the Rabbit Hutch. Her central character is a gifted, troubled teen who grew up with foster families, dropped out of high school, and calls herself Blondine. Obsessed with female medieval mystics, she takes the name of a French martyr. Gunty seamlessly weaves important issues that are pressing us daily into the fabric of this book without it ever feeling preachy or cynical. Instead, we are swept up in the characters' lives, holding our breath until the end. I found myself underlining passage after passage, each articulating something I felt was true. Here's one. Quote, "I'm surprised I called you good. Not because I think you're bad. It would be absurd to describe a whole person as good or bad. You're just a series of messy, contradicting behaviors like everyone else. Those behaviors can become patterns or instincts, and some are better than others. But as long as you're alive, the jury's out." Tess Gunty's debut novel, The Rabbit Hutch, won the 2022 National Book Award for Fiction, the Waterstones Debut Fiction Prize, and the Barnes & Noble Discover Prize. It was named one of the 12 essential reads by The New Yorker and the best book of the year by Time, NPR, the Chicago Tribune, People, the New York Times, and others. Her work has appeared in the Iowa Review, Granta, LitHub, Joyland, and Freeman's. Claire Vaye Watkins is the author of 3 works of fiction, I Love You, But I've Chosen Darkness, Gold-Famed Citrus, and Battleborn. Winner of the Story Prize, the Dylan Thomas Prize, and the Silver Pen Award from the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. A recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Lannan Foundation, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. Please welcome Tess Gunty and Claire Vaye Watkins.
Hello. Hi. Thank you for being here. I'm Claire Vaye Watkins. I'm delighted to be here with you, Tess. Congratulations on this book.
Thank you. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this.
My pleasure. Okay, let's get into it. I want to start with something that this book made me think of, something that Wallace Stegner wrote about, which was his effort to become what he called a placed rather than a displaced person. This is in Where the Bluebird Sings in the Lemonade Springs. That can't be the title, but something like that. Anyway, he's writing about an itinerant childhood and finding this real desire to create a sense of rootedness in place in his work. And I saw that in the Rabbit Hutch, in Vacca Vale, in that sweet, we have that way of describing it as a post-industrial Midwest town. So I thought we could start there because it seems to me like when I was a kid learning about what fiction is, it was like it's character, plot, and setting. And now that I've been writing a while and teaching a while, I feel like setting is often sort of forgotten. Like I read a lot of stuff that could be set anywhere. It's kind of placeless. It's kind of, sometimes the writers will say, well, you know, I set it in New York, but how about I just change it to Tampa? And I'm like, just like find and replace or what, you know? So like how does placedness and being a placed person work for you in your writing? Why write this place the way you have? Will you tell us about that a bit?
Well, I wonder if part of the reason why contemporary fiction becomes disembodied, is kind of becoming increasingly disembodied, is because of the sort of digital avalanche that we've experienced. I mean, everybody obviously during lockdown was experiencing life almost entirely digitally. Not everybody, but lots of people. And I think it's kind of interesting that this book is, I really think of the main character as this town, this fictional town, but the main human character is someone who wants to literally leave her body. She wants to be disembodied. I mean, this book kind of came from a sense that I was living in a place that was sort of an afterlife. I felt that, you know, when I was maybe 11, I went to Catholic schools, and I had this religion teacher who introduced us to the term purgatory, and she described it as a place, you know, between heaven and hell, and it was a place of eternal longing and unquenchable thirst, and everyone was just waiting indefinitely there, and it was not a meritocracy. You'd be released randomly. And she made us memorize this prayer that allegedly released 1,000 souls every time it was recited, and she would tally up the souls that we released on the board. But I mean, every time she described it, I thought, oh, that sounds familiar. We already live there. And it was exactly the same feeling I had when I was and as soon as I would enter a city that had a similar history, Flint, Michigan, Youngstown, Ohio, Gary, Indiana, it was like this sensation that hit me like a temperature drop. And it really felt like an afterlife. I was interested in writing about that atmosphere and what it does to people. And then as I tried to do that, I also found myself kind of embarking on a project to reclaim this space that was so structurally neglected. And in some ways, it's really overrepresented in American politics, but very underrepresented in American imagination. And I felt that whenever it was represented, it was caricatured and stereotyped. And I wanted to, I guess, part of the project was to insist that these like really mundane, ugly, disposable sites of strip malls, of tanning beds and vape stores could also be sites of transcendence, could also be sites of miraculous activity, and also just to observe what I was seeing and to kind of to say this is a narrative can happen here too, and the people here matter.
Yeah, that's very moving to me to hear. My hometown was probably less of a purgatory and more of a straight up hell, right down the middle. It wasn't so much deniability, but it resonated with me so much the way that you insist on, I want to say like the humanity of the place, but that's not it. It's a spiritual practice in a way to, like Flannery O'Connor put it, look long where others look away. like there are certain lands that are kind of, you sort of just delete them, you know, like you don't, and then your book just says no, like let's look at this for a really long time, especially the valley, which is sort of this beautifully described, open, old growth forest. And I love that it's not technically a valley, but the architect of the park thought that even in the Midwest, you should get to enjoy all the different topographies regardless of your geography. So the question of like you are who you are because of where you are, and then what are you going to do with that comes alive in the book. Back in the green room, you were talking about this being also kind of a moral question for you. We were talking about the differences between writing a place up close to it and then from afar. Did you write this from up close in a Vacca Vale, South Bendy, Gary-ish, Youngstown-ish place, or from afar? Tell us about your relationship to the actual like inspiration site.
Yeah, I wrote this in New York, actually. I wrote this the year after I moved to Brooklyn. And it was the first time I'd really left South Bend, because I'd gone to college there too. And I mean, I think that at that age, actually, it was the only way I could have written about my hometown, because it's so easy to lose the forest for the trees when you're both young and up close to something. I mean, everything feels like it's so up close to you when you're in your early 20s, and so I think I needed some distance from it. And I also think it was because I felt so much entrapment when I lived there, and I could only be freed from that sense of entrapment when I left, and then freed to experience all the tenderness and affection, and actually a sense of protectiveness that was activated when I left. So, I mean, I remember like I went to like a classical performance of Bolero at the Philharmonic in New York, and this woman next to me was wearing all furs, and she was like all these jewels, and she looked like she'd never left Manhattan, and she was like, "Where are you from?" I said, "Indiana," and she gasped, and she said, "I didn't know anyone was actually from there." "Did you turn the lights off when you left?" And and I felt like, oh yeah, this is why I need to write about this place, because there actually are whole swaths of the country that really dismiss it, completely dismiss it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think I was freed to experience the tenderness.
And I think that is very much tied into what you gestured towards with like the political over-representation that becomes a caricature, becomes a non-understanding, that we only might turn our gaze to these places every 4 years, depending on how their maps are made, and it isn't treated with often with the type of reverence and attention and artfulness that your book does. Is a real failure of imagination, right? I didn't know that people actually lived there. And it's interesting because Blandine does want to leave her body. She does not want to leave Vacca Vale, right? Even though, and we were talking backstage about that, there's a beautiful passage where her body really is that place. So what sort of like tenderness are you thinking of when you say like going to New York and having that distance? I imagine some of it is just like, I got some space and I can see it now. Was there sort of like nostalgia, homesickness, other dimensions of it that came from that vantage point that surprised you?
I mean, so many things come to mind, but the first thing that came to mind was actually how, I was living in a building in Crown Heights that probably inspired the building in this book more than anything I ever encountered in my hometown. And so I think one thing I was confronting was how these kinds of the forces that I saw at play in my hometown, these forces of neglect and disinvestment, were really present everywhere. And there were all of these through lines. I mean, I guess one of the questions of the book is how does structural violence generate interpersonal violence? And I was seeing that, I mean, that was a question that was on my mind all the time in Crown Heights. So that was one thing. But I think also when I went back home, I mean, I never really I felt like moving away was the right choice for me, but I think I was struck by the sort of, the humility of the place, the kind of, there's like a knee-jerk kindness there that obviously doesn't exist in New York. And there was a certain like expansiveness and quiet that I found extremely generative every time I went back home, and something that I find really sacred. But also I worked at a farmer's market throughout my teens and 20s. I worked at a bakery and they had a stand there. And this market was extremely social. There were people who would come every single weekend and not buy anything. They just kind of come to talk. And very often it'd be older people who felt left behind, and they would just stop at my stand and tell me their stories about their lives. And I think even though none of those stories were represented in this book, they became almost like an internal soundtrack as I was writing. I mean, it's impossible to not feel love for someone who's, I mean, there's no other word for it. I mean, I really felt like as they kind of exposed their lives to me, their greatest pains, joys, regrets, there's something transformative that kind of transpires between you automatically. And so those people were also, I felt a lot of tenderness toward those people and those stories.
Yeah, that's really moving to hear. I mean, maybe you can feel it in your work, that love, that it kind of, I mean, I don't want to embarrass you in front of everyone, but it really kind of restored my faith in the project of novel writing, which I've been I fall in and out of love with it. And we've been going through a rough patch recently. And, it made me remember that there's a certain way to do this that is peace work. It's about love and peace and attention, which is now a commodity in a hyper-accelerated economy, so that we are all being extracted from. And this is, I think, like the last form of media that we have that isn't ad-based. Like there are no ads in books is wild. Like, I can't believe we're getting away with it still at this point, And the attention that it takes to read them, let alone to write them, it is so rare, and that you have to, I think increasingly, I think about this when I teach, that, I tell my students, like, Dickens was not writing in an attention economy. When he needed a break, like, motherfucker would look at a candle. Like that's different. So what do you do? Like, how do you get this work, like, in this time, in this moment, when everything seems, for good reason, there's a lot that deserves our attention, also a lot that does not at all. But what's your relationship with it, just as a practicing artist? And then also, because it's one of the concerns of this book, is like, that's one of the, I would say, structures of violence that, there's a, the idea that this big act of violence at the center of the book, and one of the perpetrators says, this is going to get so many likes, right? It's being filmed. It wouldn't happen if it weren't being filmed, if there weren't the potential for these small little orgasms that would go off because this person did. So anyway, I just want to know, like, how you think about that and how you navigate it as an artist.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also shocked that we still don't have ads in books. It is miraculous. I mean, and also I found myself so, like, surveillance capitalism has become so internalized that I find myself, if I'm like lingering on a passage, I'll think, oh, wait, will the algorithm then try to sell me something because it saw that I was lingering here? But then it's like, oh no, they're not watching me. They know I bought it, though. But yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time. There was this this essay I read when I was 20, and it's quoted in this book by Simone Weil, and it's called Attention and Will. And she says, "To know that this man who is hungry and thirsty really exists as much as I do, that is enough. The rest follows of itself." And I think that's sort of the thesis statement of my life from that point forward. I mean, obviously, it's not always something that you can achieve, but it's impossible to mistreat someone. I mean, you'd have to be truly, truly, truly ill to mistreat someone if you could fully recognize their humanity, and if you could fully believe that every thought they have, every feeling they have is as real as yours. And I think this applies to non-human animals as well. And so, I mean, the way that I try to write is also just to pay, like, I don't see a difference between loving a place and paying attention to it. I think loving a person and paying attention to them. I think maybe there's a lot of ugliness, and there are a lot of grim descriptions in this book. And I don't see that as in conflict with loving the place. I think to love something is to truly see it. And so I think that's one thing I try to do, but then also in terms of my writing practice, it's really just a battle against technology. Like, it's how far can I get from the gadgets, and for how long can I get away from them? I mean, I wrote a lot of this book, or at least I drafted a lot of the central ideas for this book in Prospect Park one summer. We were talking about heat earlier, and I really think that a lot of the ideas came to me in the extreme heat of Brooklyn summer. And I wouldn't take any technology. I wouldn't take any of my phone or my laptop or anything. And just having that time, I mean, even if my phone's in another room, the knowledge that it's there will disrupt my writing. We're really in an unprecedented era of like attentional assault, and it has all sorts of consequences. But for writing, it now feels like an act of resistance against the attention economy.
Yeah, I agree. That's yeah. You find yourself sort of in a unexpected position of just holding the line and doing that again, like piecework. Like, if imaginary people are as real as I am, if rabbits are, and goats are, and trees are, and what if I could just live in that moment for just a moment? If that were true for me for just a moment, and it, I love that you're pointing out that it is. I think another way that Vaye put it is attention is prayer. Mm-hmm. That to give this thing your attention, and it doesn't mean that you are writing some sort of like a propaganda thing, right? Like, you give people the dignity to be deeply flawed, and there's this like profound balance in this book between the darkness and the light. That there's it's just so keen about how hard it is to be for the people who are in it, and they are also, each one of them is like offered this moment of transcendence. Like, there's some of the hottest sex writing I've ever seen in there. Just the beauty, especially being in Blondine's mind as she's in the valley. And it sounds like Prospect Park was sort of the inspiration for that. And I'm not surprised, because it is written in a way that suggests that almost that other like non-human presences helped you write it. I mean, there's descriptions of just clover, like we've seen, but you haven't seen it at all until you've read these passages about the beauty of these ordinary little invasive species. That's not really a question, just to gush a bit about it. The Valley and Blandine's campaign against it, she reminded me a bit of The Girls in the Quick and the Dead by Joy Williams. Have you read that?
Oh, yeah. That was the book that started this book for me.
Oh, great.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Oh, that book is incredible. There's 3 teenage girls at the center of it, and they are budding eco-terrorists. And it's 2000, maybe before that, actually, maybe a late 90s book, but it's so prescient and important. So, eco-terrorism, for or against? Is it time, you think? Property damage, at least? A little escalation in the tactics? She has some very inventive tactics, I think. Yeah. I was persuaded by them.
I mean, we actually live in a time of eco-terrorism. Like, we can flip it on its head and be like, actually, what's being done to us is terrorism. What's being done to our ecosystems is terrorism. And I, for some reason, have like internalized guilt about this. Like, I've also been responsible for it, and for so long, I spoke about these kinds of, deforestation and all of these other industrial agriculture as though I were, of course I'm complicit, I do live in these systems, but I think we should all actually allow ourselves to say, no, that's not how I would do this. If I were in charge and if I had a different option, I wouldn't participate in these systems. So I mean, Blondine doesn't actually hurt anybody, but I do think that this inventive form of protest, she ends up sort of crashing this celebratory dinner before they start the revitalization and like throwing voodoo dolls and fake blood all over the developers' table right before they eat. And there's a story about my grandmother. I don't know if this is apocryphal, but she apparently every time the KKK would come into their town, this is a terrible sentence, they would it was like a primarily white town, so they knew that people wouldn't be as threatened there. So they would try to stop the KKK in their town before they could get elsewhere. And they would put tacks, like my grandmother and her friends would put tacks under the tires of all of their cars so that their cars would break down. And there was something about that little act of resistance by a woman in the 1900s that I found so compelling, because obviously they know that they're not going to stop white supremacy by putting tacks under the tires of cars, but there's something about the kind of pedestrian, daily act of resistance in these kind of creative, almost playful manifestations of activism that I find really hopeful. And so I mean, I'm not sure if I really think that the forces that we're facing in terms of ecosystem destruction are so vast that it's going to require. There's this poet that I don't know, survived. That was quoted to me by another poet, so I can't remember exactly the context. But basically, these poets are always quoting each other. But they were like, he had survived a military. He'd been a military prisoner. He'd been a prisoner of war. And when he got out of prison, he said, "We have to push back with the force of the junta. We have to push back with the same kind of military force that's been pushing against us." And I kind of do feel that when it comes to the climate crisis, we have to push back with the force of the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, and you're so right, I think, about this pendulum that I think of swinging from denial to an over-responsibility, an over-emphasis on personal responsibility and personal choices, even though to use less, to buy less, to recycle are very sweet ways of living. I like eating vegetables now. That's nice, But the fact is we are not all equally responsible. I didn't make millions of dollars from it, although, my pension is where it is and so on, but that these decisions, if we accept over responsibility, it actually prevents us from understanding where the culpability actually lies, which is the design of this phenomenon now, where a generation of propaganda and denial and stalling tactics has effectively taken up the space where a real robust debate about it is happening. We talked about that for 40 years. Instead of what should we do about it, who should own it, why did it happen, so now you have, phenomenon like greenwashing or green capitalism, and eventually we have to come to terms with the fact that these interests are divergent. The profit motive and clean air and water are not cooperative. And we seem to, it's just taking a really long time for that to sink in. I think because of how paralyzing it feels to feel, that your wealth and your comfort is another person's suffering and pain, and that you didn't choose it. I think this is something that Joy Williams is so lucid on. Like, if we accept that, well, I drove a car, so I don't get to say, I mean, that's Rex Tillerson's wet dream right there, is that we would, okay, well then everyone shut up unless you're a saint. And even the saints are, suffering and have to drive, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's so many towns in America that were designed to require cars. It's not an option for most people. Yeah, so many of the individual opting out choice, they're not options for most people. And that was so evident during COVID too. Like everyone was using more electricity at their homes and in their homes more than ever, and yet fossil fuel emissions decreased because industries shut down, because massive buildings shut down, and people weren't on the road all the time driving, massive cargo shipments. It's the extraction economy, the extractive model, this growth imperative. All of these things are completely incompatible with a healthy future. And unless there's some kind of extreme policy intervention, I mean, I do think that individual choices are locked in a feedback loop with policy intervention. I think that when popular opinion starts to shift, then politicians can respond. So I don't dismiss individual action or resistance, but it's certainly not enough. Yeah.
Right, and I agree with you. I actually feel a lot more hopeful about this than I did 10 years ago, because once your sky is the wrong color, things can change pretty quickly, right? Like, our friends on the East Coast just enjoyed their first orange skies, and I heard a change. Like, I heard a real change from like national media outlets all the way to my individual relationships, where people are like, I'm really scared. I don't like not being able to go outside. And it's like, yeah, uh-huh. And another thing that we seem to be kind of shedding is the idea that there is a safe place. I feel like 15 years ago or so, my friends and I, who were sort of starting our adult lives, were saying, where should we live? Well, Chicago's not inland from the coast, or this place has that elevation, or as if there was some place to go, because we weren't really we weren't really understanding the interconnectedness, and that's something that this book is so beautiful about, the way that people, they do have an impact, they do matter, and that's a beautiful, like, a source of love and impact. It's also a huge responsibility, and just the way that you managed to put this whole thing together to illustrate that without making it seem like this is your medicine that you have to take. Like, how did the structure come to you? Was it the building itself and you sort of able to move around? Was the scope always so big?
It was, I mean, I think the first half of the book really was written associatively, and then as it kind of closed in on the last third, I was increasingly aware that I needed to just look at the structure from a kind of aerial perspective. So I ended up, actually it was a class that John Freeman taught, that I took before he's now my editor, but he was my professor first, and he had us map our projects for the final project in this class. And you could kind of do anything you wanted. You could make an actual map, you could make a spreadsheet, you could do anything. And I just made note cards and put them around my room of the major events, major characters, kind of places and movements, and which day each event was occurring on, because this takes place over 3 days. And I always knew it was polyphonic. I always knew that I was going to put it in a very short amount of time. I was going to set everything within 3 days. But that was the practice that enabled me to structure the final third of the book, really the final half of the book, and also I took tons of stuff out at that point and deleted like hundreds of pages, and then added things, because you can see it almost more like a painting then. You see the composition, you see what's needed for balance, And it was still it was very much an intuitive kind of animal process. I don't think I could explain why I was choosing to add a scene in, Joan's perspective here or whatever, but I think it was almost like a visual composition. You could see there needs to be some light here, there needs to be some darkness here. But Building Stories by Chris Ware, have you, it's like
wild project.
Yes, I think I read Joy Williams' book. The Quick and the Dead was the first Joy Williams book I read, but then I read all her work. And then the Chris Ware, it's like this, it comes like a board game, and it's a series of comics that you can read in any order about an apartment building. And that was really inspiring for the structure of this novel. I thought, I already was setting it in an apartment building. I could just use that as the structure of the novel. So that helped. But I really am extremely inefficient when it comes to structuring.
Yeah, I mean, wonderfully so, because it's intuitive, and so it seems organic, like if the earth is inefficient making a crystal or something, because that's the shape that it must be. And I'm not surprised to hear you say that it was like an intuitive kind of animal process. But then there's also these just really clever formal conceits of chapter by chapter. We'll move around from apartment to apartment or change. Everyone has their own music. Moses, he was a really surprising, difficult character for me. I love how he's like niche Morgellons, like he has a kind of Morgellons, the thing with the little fibers coming out of your skin thing, but he's better than them because he doesn't acknowledge that, and he's like, no, mine is because I'm God, basically. Anyway, so that like sensing into, was it hard for anyone? Like Moses ends up having, forgive this pun, it's so corny, but so much light in his storyline. Was there anyone that you like struggled to give that balance to, or you just were you ever tempted to just leave someone in the darkness? Or is this, it seems like my sense from reading you is that that's not really compatible with like how you want to be, like how you're writing this because this is how you are in the world. But was that ever a issue to find the light in some of these folks?
Definitely with Moses, actually. That was, that's very astute. It was, I found him, I'm not sure, he came early in the drafting process, but he was so hard for me I couldn't really enter his psychology the way that I felt I could immediately enter the psychology of the others. And it kind of worked because he was the one outsider coming to the town in the beginning, but he's also the only character who is from an enormous amount of structural privilege, but at the same time he's really suffering. But he was always like scratching his skin in early drafts, and it was like a compulsion. He was like bleeding, and it was my advisor, Rick Moody, who actually pointed out to me, he's like, I think he has he diagnosed Moses with Morgellons.
That's nice.
And then I had read this Leslie Jameson essay about, I don't know if you've read that. So maybe that was on my mind, but it was like, I thought this character, he would have some kind of alternate explanation because he wants to believe that. But then oddly, that was actually my entrance into kind of identifying with him. Like I felt, obviously my experiences are nothing like his, but there is something with, I think with all artists, if you grow up like hypersensitive to stimuli, people who are drawn to creativity tend to have that in common. And it can feel like such a curse and a burden for most of your life because contemporary life is just not at all designed to accommodate that kind of sensory experience.
Yes, I've noticed that. That explains a lot for me.
But I remember my mom would always tell me I'd have like a lot of panic as a child, and she would always tell me like, it's because you're an artist. And there was something like so really life-saving about the belief that your sensitivity or that your kind of your worst experiences could be an indication of something special or something good. And so, when Moses thinks he's a prophet because he has this experience, I thought, I understand you now. There's something about you I understand. And I mean, I don't know if I feel like I don't feel a need to kind of like redeem the characters or to give them a sense of revelation or something, but I do feel that I haven't really done my job if anyone comes off as a cartoon villain, if anyone comes off as a villain at all. At the end of the day, I think that even villains, I mean, we have them for sure in life. One ran our country for a while, but like even to like whatever they're responding to internally is persuasive to them. It might not even be rationally persuasive, but it is these forces that are acting within and upon them are persuasive. And if you can enter that, then you probably won't get a lot of, like, I think when people say that a character is unlikable, what they actually mean is that they don't understand why a character is doing what they're doing. And as soon as you enter those forces, the mystery of that person's kind of internal narrative gets dissolved.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me ricochet back to what you were saying about the attention economy and the feeling of reading a book and not wanting to hover over a passage because you haven't internalized the surveillance of it, and how difficult it is to appreciate that novels are very private thoughts usually, you know, and though people read a huge volume now these days, I think that what a lot of us are taking in is very public thoughts, very like, hear ye, like this is what I think, right? And novels are doing something else, and that can be, it can be the first time that someone's been invited into someone's private thoughts. Or I particularly see this teaching when there's a sense of, and often it's a gendered phenomenon where a young man will say of a very convincing and challenging story from the perspective of a woman, I didn't like that feeling. And when we, you know, I'm like, well, I've got an hour, let's go into that, you know? And it's often like, this person has no agency. This person has no power. I didn't like, why are they doing what they're doing? And it's like, yeah, that might be a feeling that you're not entirely used to feeling because of the way you're walking around in space. And so you've been able to like come into someone else's head and experience that. And it is beautiful and redemptive, and I mostly really like believe in the value of it, but that's not to say that it's easy, and it's certainly not easy to create, right? It's hard enough sometimes to read that, right? It's not a mystery to, sometimes people will be like, I don't know why people don't read more short stories. Like, we like short things now. I'm like, a short story is really hard on you. Like, it's a very challenging. It's not playing around. It's not an advertisement, you know? It's not like going to spoon feed you, right? One of my students said, this doesn't chew your food for you, right? It's hard work. So I guess I know we're going to go do some questions. It's almost time, but my last question for you is if you could just talk to us about what this book cost you to write and what it gave you.
Wow. I'd love to hear your answer to this, too.
I mean, it gave me everything because I just read
about this book, about your own work. No, I mean, it was over a period of 5 years that I drafted this before I submitted it anywhere, so it's hard to condense that time because I moved, I had different jobs, and you know, I was really working in the gig economy that entire time. But I think it really permanently changed my relationship to my home. I think that happened for so many reasons, but it also happened because so much of my experience of my hometown was, I had nothing to compare it to growing up because I didn't leave until I was 22. And when I was researching for the book, there was this, I feel like there should be a word for this phenomenon where, like, basically my whole life we were raised to think that this was like a normal place to live, with, it was just an average place to live. And yet it felt very dangerous, it felt very bleak, and it felt very, it just felt very failed. And I think I was gaslighting myself all my life about like, maybe you're just perceiving something that's not there. But then when I was researching for the book and seeing the statistics about like, oh yeah, my town was like rates of violent crime were way higher than the state's average, and the state's average were way higher than the national average. And, you know, and every single measurement of like well-being that you can think of was off the charts. Yes, Indiana has the most polluted natural waterways of any state in America. There was like a coal plant near where I grew up. There was a ton of agriculture around us, you know, monocrops and pesticides, and so I think in some ways that was, it was really therapeutic to think, no, everything you were feeling was real, and everything you were observing around you was real. And then I think also it just gave me, this book, I think, because of Joy Williams sort of taught, I think her humor is really generated by looking the dark matter of life in the eye. And when I was reading all of her work, but especially The Quick and the Dead, you start to think, you know, she has that kind of contagious sense of humor. There's a sort of, like a shimmer of instability or unreality to her work. And at any moment, something could be uncanny or could be hilarious. And she's someone who's really laugh out loud funny, but also really serious and engaged with, grim things. So in kind of reading her work and trying to kind of conjure something similar in my own writing, I think there's something that I gained in terms of, like a kind of ability to see the absurdity more. Like you're trained on the absurdities in life, you know, it's a muscle that you're exercising.
Yeah, well said. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we can do questions. There's a question. I think a microphone will come to you.
Thank you. I just loved the character of Blondine. I mean, right from the get-go. And I love hearing that it was very intuitive for you. I'm just curious about how she showed up, how she took form, how she landed. She's like some sort of pagan saint for our times. You know, it was very welcome. I loved her. So thank you for bringing her into the world. But I'd love to know your experience of that.
Well, thank you for saying that. She appeared to me really as an image. Like I could see, this doesn't normally happen, but I could see her so clearly. She was standing in front of a gas station. She was drinking a blue slushie. Her clothes were oversized. She looked like she hadn't slept in a long time, and she had white hair, and she was a teenager, and the only thing I knew about her was that she wanted to be a mystic, but she wasn't at all religious. And that was where I started, and I think as I wrote her, she really became, this also has never happened to me, but she kind of became a hero to me. Like I've never actually written a character that I feel I can look up to, but that happened. She was kind of a hero that I think I had always longed to see in fiction. And part of it had to do with her, she's an extremely active character. She's survived pretty brutal things, and yet she's always kind of moving and doing something. She's always kind of fighting back in one way or another. And so that was always a quality that it was never something that came easily to me, that kind of the fighting instinct. And then also I think because she was someone who absolutely refused to define herself by the qualities that her environment was telling her, you know, were the most valuable qualities she could possess. She instead insisted on really defining herself by her activism, her intellect, her curiosity, and everyone around her is saying, well, you should just be happy that all these men want to date you, you know. I think that in the Midwest, but really everywhere, the girls are taught from a young age that beauty is the most valuable currency they can possess, and if they possess it, then that will grant them economic mobility and happiness and all the rest. And it was kind of wish fulfillment to write a character who was offered that currency and just vehemently rejected it.
There's one.
see if I can shorten the question here. The main question is about ecstasy. I've not read the book, but the subject came up about a sex scene being very sexy. But I'm talking about ecstasy in a different sense, in the sense of Teresa de Avila, you know, ecstasy of religion. Does ecstasy play a role in the book and in your theosophy of life?
Actually, there is Teresa of Avila's kind of passage on a divine ecstatic experience is copied in the book. There's a there's a whole passage that's supposed to be hanging above Blondine's bed that she's memorized. And yes, I mean, I think for Catholicism, which is a religion that really punishes pleasure in every possible way, they really, really go all out on divine ecstasy. So, I mean, when I read that passage for the first time, it was so like it's so sensual, it's so erotic, and what she's describing is an angel coming to her and piercing her heart with this like white hot love that's painful and also the most intense pleasure she's ever experienced in her life, and it lasts for days and she can't speak afterwards. And I mean that's so much more intense than 50 Shades of Grey or like any other. I think it's something that I feel like it's in direct relationship with the kind of Catholic maybe fetishization of pain, like and suffering. Like, you know, I grew up really, really Catholic, and I feel like there was, you know, every year we'd have a reenactment of the Stations of the Cross. And you were just, as a child, I was like watching this, you know, you're told this really happened. This man is nailed to a piece of wood and dragged through a square. Like, that's from Game of Thrones, and yet children have to watch it every single year at church and like then hunt for Easter eggs. It's incredibly bizarre, but I think that has to do with it. Yeah, it's in a relationship with the ecstasy. It can't really be. I think that those things are inextricable. There's a phrase that my undergraduate advisor Joy L. McSweeney uses, which I find useful, which is indivisible opposites. And yeah, I think that the ecstasy and the suffering in this book, and really in my imagination, since it was so informed by the Catholic Church, that it's an indivisible opposite.
Yeah, it's a huge part of the book. And the suffering that the place has endured almost demands that transcendence and the ecstasy as well. Yeah.
Right. I think that there's something about the pressure of a very bleak reality that then it's like a diamond, like that intense pressure inevitably will create some form of escape. You know, you will always be seeking some form of escape. And for Blondine, it's a kind of divine ecstasy.
We have time for one more.
Into the mic. You mentioned starting the book in a very associative way, and your characters are rising that way. And I was thinking about Moses, who came to you early, you said, and how he feels structurally inserted into the book in the sense that he's not from the Rabbit Hutch and so forth. And so how did that process work?
I mean, I really think this is a result of creating so many of these characters in in one really hot summer so long ago. But it's kind of hard to remember exactly how he arrived. I do remember thinking, and it just came to me, like, what if there was a middle-aged man who covers his body in the liquid of broken glow sticks and punishes his enemies, freaks him out.
Like you do.
It just arrived almost like a joke that was like missing half of itself. Like I couldn't figure out how that would have happened, and for so long I was working on this book and I was working on another one at the same time, and I thought the other one was going to be my real book, and this one was the thing I was like working on secretly and I didn't show to anyone. And it kind of got to a point where I had to choose which project to focus on. And I was seeing this psychoanalyst at the time, and I was describing both of these projects to him because he was also an artist, and he would give me like great artistic advice. And he said, when I described the first one, which is a very somber, like dystopian kind of language-driven novel about an agricultural town, he kind of nodded. And then when I described this novel, I just kind of described the characters that had come to me. And when I described Moses, he started to laugh. He started to laugh really hard, and he'd never laughed in our sessions before. He never laughed after that. I'm sure they trained them not to laugh. But there's something about that response that made me want to pursue this book, but especially wanting to pursue Moses and trying to figure out how this character, how this unbelievable behavior could become believable and inevitable in him. So he was the person that I had to, I realized like one of the reasons I was having problems with his character was that so many of my scenes with him were, he was alone. And so in revision, as I was trying to figure out who he was, I kept having to add people into the scene for him to interact with, and that's when he revealed himself.
I know. I was going to ask you to read a bit. Do you think you could end with that? I meant to do it at the beginning. Would you read just a bit so we could hear the music of it?
Definitely, yeah.
Okay. All right.
I'll read a passage that Claire had recommended. It's this first conversation, really, that Blondine is having with one of her roommates, Jack. And he says, and she says, I don't have social media. And he says, oh, right. He rolls his eyes. Too good for all that. She shakes her head. Not at all. On the contrary, I'm too weak for it. I mean, everyone is, but I'm especially susceptible to its false rewards, It's designed to addict you, to prey on your insecurities and use them to make you stay. It exploits everybody's loneliness and promises us community, approval, friendship. Honestly, in that sense, social media is a lot like the Church of Scientology or QAnon or Charles Manson. And then on top of that, weaponizing a person's isolation, it convinces every user that she is a minor celebrity, forcing her to curate some sparkly and artificial sampling of her best experiences, demanding a nonstop social performance that has little in common with her inner life, intensifying her narcissism, multiplying her anxieties, narrowing her worldview, all while commodifying her, harvesting her data and selling it to nefarious corporations so they can peddle more shit that promises to make her prettier, smarter, more productive, more successful, more beloved. And throughout all this, you have to act stupefied by your own good luck. Everybody's like, words cannot express how fortunate I feel to have found this amazing group of people, blah, blah, blah. It makes me sick. Everybody influencing, everybody under the influence, everybody staring at their own godforsaken profile, searching for proof that they're lovable. And then once you're nice and distracted by the hard work of tallying up all your failures and comparing them to other people's triumphs, that's when the algorithmic predators of late capitalism can pounce, enticing you to partake in consumeristic, financially irresponsible forms of so-called self-care, which is really just advanced selfishness. Facials, pedicures, smoothie packs delivered to your door. And like this is just the surface stuff, the stuff that oxidizes you personally. But 1,000 little obliterations add up, The macro damage that results is even scarier. The hacking, the political nefarious robots, the opinion echo chambers, fear-mongering, erosion of truth, et cetera, et cetera. And don't get me started on the destruction of public discourse. I mean, that's just my view. Obviously, to each her own. But personally, I don't need it. Any of it. Blondine cracks her neck. I'm corrupt enough.
Thank you both for a terrific discussion. Thank you. And Tess Gunty will be signing in the lobby, so please get your book if you haven't read it. And thank you all for being here. And check out what Aloud has going on this summer, because we'd love to see you again. Thank you. Thank you.